Gandalf, Frodo, orcs, Mordor, Gondor, and the fight against good and evil. Some of the most iconic names, places, and themes in the history of pop culture. Lord of the Rings has been at the forefront of fantasy for almost 100... Jesus Christ. It has been portrayed in so many successful and, well, unsuccessful ways in the past. From the original trilogy of movies, creating a cult fanbase that still hasn't, and I don't think ever will, go away. Some of the best games to release were during the early 2000s alongside these movies. But there was a forgotten child. One that many played but wasn't quite as loved as the rest, and it didn't stick around. In fact, so much so that the only way that you can play this game today is by owning an old Xbox 360 copy or the PC ROM disc, which, I mean, who has them? This game was Lord of the Rings Conquest. But what's the history of the title? And will it just be forgotten into the abyss even now, 13 years later? In 2005, Pandemic Studios released the ever-popular Star Wars Battlefront 2, a team-based recreation of all the levels in every Star Wars movie, from the Phantom Menace to the Return of the Jedi, as the Republic, the CIS, the Rebels, or the Empire across a galactic conquest, instant action, the campaign, or even multiplayer. It was so well received, in fact, that EA at the time, who were the publishers, asked the developer Pandemic to carry on this series, to use the mechanics, gameplay, and pretty much everything else about it, down to even the UI, to make a new title. This time set in another incredibly big and popular franchise. The product of this was Lord of the Rings Conquest. It did what you would expect. Similarly to Star Wars Battlefront 2, it had many of the missions from the movies, whether it was in cutscenes or actually replaying every step of the way from the Fellowship. It also had instant action and some fun game modes like playing as hobbits defending the Shire, or taking control of Ents and chucking Isengard's own down pits for a unique demise. It was never quite as refined as its Star Wars predecessor though, but it was still pretty fun. Yet there are many mechanics that didn't quite carry over as much as I guess they expected them to. Most notably is the change from blasters and guns in Star Wars to swords and magic in Lord of the Rings. It worked within Conquest, but it wasn't anywhere near perfect. I think the most plain example is the overpowered nature of melee moves within Conquest itself. To make up for the lack of projectile weapons, Pandemic decided to make the melee moves, the hand-to-hand fighting, so strong against the enemy AI. Playing as an archer in Lord of the Rings Conquest saw you chain-kicking enemies as your feet were as powerful as cannonballs. There wasn't all that much use for the bow when you could kick a guy down a hole or constantly stun him in a chain. Despite this though, I love the unique nature of being able to track through the story as seen in the movies, playing as the forces of good, Faramir, Aragorn, Legolas, and so on, but also having the option for an evil campaign, trying to stop the Fellowship from destroying the One Ring and Sauron rising back to power. Complete custom missions that we hadn't really experienced within Middle-earth before. Unfortunately, despite many of the previous Lord of the Rings tie-in games having the original cast members return to voice themselves, Lord of the Rings Conquest came out much later than the movies, so only Hugo Weaving returned to reprise his role as Elrond, and this was a pattern that we're going to see quite a lot. Because of its 2009 release, it was a bit later from the movies, and it was in this awkward moment in the Lord of the Rings timeline. There were no other films on their way, and the third movie had reached its hype years and years before. It seemed like Lord of the Rings Conquest came a little bit out of nowhere and didn't quite have a place to slot in with the wider Lord of the Rings franchise. I think because of a lot of this, the response wasn't all that positive on release. Many recollected the incredibly exciting feeling of a Lord of the Rings style Battlefront game, but being just a bit disappointed, mostly by its content and substance. Missions weren't quite as fleshed out as the previous Star Wars title, and it felt kind of rushed, not quite as intricately designed and loved as Star Wars Battlefront 2 had. The game's combat was also criticised, being cited as too repetitive and too hacky and slashy. Fighting against the bots with blasters in Star Wars Battlefront 2 gave a little bit of leeway because you had this more tactical gameplay style, hiding behind cover, using more projectiles and shooting rather than hand-to-hand stuff. It was a little bit easier to execute, but when you try and translate this same combat system to swords and axes, having that same one-button attack to shoot now became a one-button attack to use your sword, meaning that you could spam one button over and over again, X for light attacks, and then maybe if you need to, you can use Y and B for medium and heavy special attacks, but mostly you could just spam enemies out of existence, especially since there were waves and waves of completely brain-dead enemies that didn't really know what was going on at the time. The only way you would actually die in this game is by going out of your way to charge into a fray that there was no way you could win in, or just being a general idiot. There wasn't all that much of a challenge within Conquest. Balance was also a major issue, the mage class especially being outed for being incredibly overpowered, having personal shields to block enemy attacks whilst bombarding those same enemies with fireballs and lightning from a distance. Not only this, but if the enemies do somehow manage to get up close, the mage has this weirdly powerful melee attack with the staff that it could just do as much damage as any other swordsman class. These complaints were only exacerbated within the other versions of the game, most notably being the DS version. Yes, there was a Nintendo DS version of Lord of the Rings Conquest. It did exist. I mean, remember when people used to make handhold versions of these classics? I mean, it seems like a dead concept now, but it was a big thing back then. So the game wasn't great. People hated it, right? Well, not exactly. Lord of the Rings Conquest seems to be the perfect example of critics hate us, but the players love us. Whilst it seems to have been completely forgotten from the forefront of many people's minds, every time I bring it up in a video or in conversation, the resounding opinion that I get seems to be one of much nostalgia and joy that the title brought the fanbase. Having the option to take control of mythical creatures like trolls or ents, like you would as a vehicle in Star Wars Battlefront, playing split screen with a friend and working together, but both secretly trying to do better than the other one. So you'd get that opportunity to play as your favorite hero. I mean, Legolas was cool, Gimli was better, but Gandalf was the best. I get messages all the time, people asking me how can they find this game now, how can they play it again, yet unfortunately I don't have the answer. As I referred to at the start of this video, it's gone, lost to the ether. You can no longer find or buy this game, at least not on modern systems. I could go and buy the CD-ROM off Amazon, but no PCs I own have a disc port anymore, so what's the point? I could go and buy the Xbox version from a second-hand store, but I don't have an Xbox 360. And as far as I know, it was abandoned by EA, so I really doubt there's much backwards compatibility with the other Xboxes in the franchise. So it's almost impossible to get your hands on the game now. So is that it for Lord of the Rings Conquest? Is it gone forever? Well, not quite. Lord of the Rings Conquest Reimagined is on its way, and goddamn is God's work being done by a few passionate fans here, recreating for free out of their own spare time the entire game within Unreal Engine 4. Modern graphics, a new combat system, new AI, even full new missions that were never within the base game. This is going to be the definitive version that all the critics at the time wanted, but available for free on modern systems. I have made numerous videos going in depth about this title, so go and check them out if you want to know more. But if not, all you need to know is that it is coming, and my god, are these guys working hard on it. So I, for one, could not be happier. Lord of the Rings Conquest was never the best game ever. Hell, it wasn't even close to being the best Lord of the Rings game ever, but I still adored it. Split screen in the evenings after school with my friends. These are the memories that are impossible to recreate now, and everybody has that game that triggers old times of playing comfort titles. Whilst mechanically, gameplay-wise, or even visually, Lord of the Rings Conquest was never and still isn't anything special. That's just what it is for me. My ultimate comfort game. And I feel like it will always stay that way, even now, 13 years later.